One of the trickiest parts about all of this stuff is that you won't find these ideas in a book. At least, not if you look where you're supposed to look. Consider the neuronormative preference for inclusion or exclusion as the primary information being sought in any context. The construction, the inclusion, the exclusion, and the movement within structures of normativity and the enforcement of those structures. Now apply that to a book. In this context, the primary information being sought and being navigated regarding that book is where it should be shelved, how we should be reading it, and how other people feel about how it should be read. Where this book occupies a space in the system of inclusion and exclusion, how it can serve that overarching structure, and how it is passed around inside that structure. With the rare exception of books that are actually about library science, the contents of very, very few books have much to say about what shelf they should occupy. It also presents some rather strange problems. Real-world examples like, is Guy Debord's The Spectacle fiction? Is it nonfiction? Or, for that matter, most of the primary contributors to the philosophical theory of existentialism are not shelved as philosophy. They're novelists. And there's a good example right there. To gain what I would consider any substantial grasp of the precepts and themes of existentialism, you need to read outside philosophy. But for someone for whom the primary information priority is always on this system of inclusion-exclusion, they'll never get there. Or rather, they have to take a very, very circuitous road to get there. And I think this is one of the reasons why, well over a century later, we still collectively have an enormous struggle with postmodernism. Take this notion of taxonomical structure of books, that a book, in some way, shape, or form, tells us on what shelf it ought to be. That's a natural inference from this priority structure. Baked into that is the idea that a book also tells you how to read it, what kind of information you should or shouldn't be looking for in it. Read science books to learn about science, read history books to learn about history, read philosophy books to learn about philosophy, and nary the twain shall meet. The central conceit of modernism is that through intellectual and material exploration and investigation, we are uncovering truths about the universe that we occupy. That Isaac Newton's laws of motion are true, that it is true that protons, neutrons, and electrons behave in these particular ways, and that we can do so without narrative bias. The problem with this is perhaps best illustrated with an example from the information technology world of the late 90s, early aughts. An extensible markup language was being radically and widely promoted as the holy grail data technology. And one of the buzz phrases that was getting kicked around a lot was that XML constituted self-describing data. That this was data that would tell you how to read it and would not require external parsing instruction. Well, all of us who had to go in and hand code in all of those markup tags can tell you the data was not self-describing, and we're still doing it today. Inserting a descriptor or asserting a descriptor upon the data did not change the fact that the data itself was not self-describing. If you had a number in a particular position, that number itself doesn't say what that number refers to. You have to add extra information, and that is where the description comes in. It's as simple as, that is 237. First off, that is a descriptor. It's a referent. 237, okay, that's a value. But 237 what? Again, we need to know more, and we invariably append more. This applies to all of our descriptors. This applies to scientific information, literary information, personal, emotive, subjective description. It applies, frankly, unilaterally. And if Quine is to be taken seriously at all, it applies to mathematical truths as well. We make choices in what we assert, what we don't, how we frame the things that we assert and how we don't. We are storytelling all the time. This doesn't mean these descriptors aren't useful. It doesn't mean that we aren't uncovering information upon which we can reliably act. But it does mean that we are not in a position of peeling back some hidden epistemological layer from the cosmos and reading the instructions written on the underside of it, which are very conveniently in a language that we know how to read. One of my longest friendships is with a woman who goes by Scouty, and she is a literary theorist. Her primary area of interest and expertise is how stories work in a mechanical sense. Not just, is this good, is this bad? Does this person inherit influences from that person? Not that, but just when someone reads a story, what is happening in their mind? Her husband is a physicist, and a physicist of strata where, well, once in a while, CERN sends him stuff to take a look at and hear what he has to say about it. And one day, he came home in a flurry, ranting, and Scouty runs downstairs from her office and asks him what's wrong, and he says, "Nothing's wrong, but I get it. It's all narrative." And he gestures at the papers on his desk. These are all stories that we are telling. We're watching, we're observing, and then we're telling stories about what we see. I get it. That is the postmodern crisis. It is a moment in which we understand and claim responsibility, and in so doing, reclaim power for how we incorporate the concept of truth in our lives. Because the truth is, I can peel an orange and it does not have an FDA label written on the inside. The data is not self-describing, and the data is not intrinsic to the object I am observing. I am observing, and I am telling a story about what I observe. Because the data is not self-describing, because, with the exception of books that are specifically about library science, books don't tell us what shelf they belong on. We have intellectual liberty to derive ideas from whatever sources present themselves to us. We can identify and interrogate the implicit racism in a math test. We can challenge ourselves with the philosophical and sociocultural commentary implications of a comic book. We can revel in the beauty, the poetry of the metaphors of physics. We can extrapolate knowledge on any subject from any source. And some of the most transformative and personally liberating ideas come when we read a book the way that we're not supposed to.